The air in the executive suite was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and ambition. Eleanor Voss, CEO of Voss Enterprises, leaned back in her leather chair, her sharp eyes scanning the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 38, she was a titan in the tech world, her name synonymous with ruthless innovation and a personal life as guarded as her company's proprietary algorithms. Her tailored suit, crisp and navy, hugged her frame with the precision of a well-coded program, and her auburn hair was swept into a bun that suggested both elegance and control. She was untouchable, or so she thought, until a whim born of boredom and a late-night glass of bourbon led to the most audacious challenge of her career. It was 8 p.m., and the office was a ghost town except for the faint hum of a vacuum cleaner echoing from the lower floors. Eleanor had stayed late to finalize a merger that would cement her company's dominance in AI-driven logistics. Her mind, usually a steel trap of focus, was restless. She'd overheard her assistant gossiping about a janitor who played piano in the company's rarely used lounge, a relic from the building's previous owners, a music publishing firm. The grand piano, a gleaming Steinway, sat in a corner of the lounge, untouched except for the occasional dusting. The idea of a janitor, of all people, playing it intrigued her. She didn't know why it mattered, but the thought of someone so ordinary doing something so refined gnawed her. She pressed the intercom. "Margaret, get the janitor up here." "The one who plays piano." Her assistant's voice crackled with confusion. "Miss Voss, it's late." "I think Heather." "Now," Eleanor said, her tone leaving no room for debate. 10 minutes later, a man stood in her doorway, his navy jumpsuit slightly worn at the cuffs, a mop handle still in one hand. He was in his early 30s, with dark hair that fell in loose waves over his forehead and eyes that held a quiet intensity, like a storm waiting to break. His name tag read Lucas. He didn't fidget or bow his head like most employees did in her presence. Instead, he stood straight, his gaze meeting hers with an unsettling calm. "You play piano," Eleanor said, not a question but a statement. Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable. "I do." She tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. The bourbon had loosened her edges, and a reckless idea took shape. She was tired of predictable boardroom games, tired of men who saw her as a trophy or a threat. Maybe it was the late hour or the thrill of doing something absurd, but she wanted to test this man, to see what lay beneath his unassuming exterior. "If you can play Chopin," she said, her voice low and teasing, "I'll marry you." The words hung in the air, absurd and electric. Lucas's brow lifted slightly, the only sign he'd heard her. Eleanor expected him to laugh, to stammer, to back away from the challenge. Instead, he set them up against the wall and said, "Which piece?" Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected him to take her seriously. "Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2, she said, choosing one of Chopin's most lyrical and technically demanding pieces. It was a favorite of her late mother, a concert pianist who'd filled their home with music before cancer stole her away. Eleanor hadn't heard it played live in years. Lucas nodded, as if she'd asked him to mop the floor. The lounge. Then, she stood, smoothing her suit, and gestured for him to lead the way. Her heels clicked against the marble as they descended to the 3rd floor. The lounge, a dimly lit space with velvet curtains and a bar that hadn't been stocked in years. The Steinway sat in the corner, its black lacquer catching the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the windows. Eleanor crossed her arms, leaning against the bar, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Lucas sat at the piano, his movements unhurried. He flexed his fingers, not in a showy way but with the quiet focus of someone who knew what they were doing. The first notes of the nocturne spilled into the room, soft and deliberate, each phrase unfolding like a secret. Eleanor's breath caught. His hands moved with a grace that didn't match the worn jumpsuit, the calloused fingers. The music was alive, tender yet precise, each chord a brushstroke painting memories she'd buried deep. Her mother's hands on the keys, the smell of jasmine in their old house, evenings when the world felt whole. He didn't just play, he wove the music into the air, the melody rising and falling like a heartbeat. Eleanor's smirk was gone, replaced by something she didn't recognize: a vulnerability, maybe, or awe. She'd expected competence at best, a passable rendition from an amateur. But this was something else. This was mastery. When the final note faded, Lucas turned to her. His expression still calm, almost defiant. "Good enough?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time in years, Eleanor Voss was speechless. She'd thrown out the challenge as a joke, a way to amuse herself, but now she felt exposed, as if he'd seen through her carefully constructed walls. She managed a nod, her voice catching. "Where did you learn to play like that?" He shrugged, standing from the bench. "My mother taught me." She was a music teacher before she passed. Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to ask more, to unravel the mystery of this man who cleaned her floors and played like a prodigy, but pride held her back. "Instead," she said, "you're wasted as a janitor." His lips twitched. Not quite a smile. "I like the quiet. Gives me time to think." She stared at him, the weight of her own words pressing against her. Marry him? It was absurd, a drunken quip she'd never follow through on. And yet, the way he looked at her, not with ambition or fear, but with a quiet certainty, made her feel unsteady. She was Eleanor Voss, untouchable, unmovable. But tonight, in this forgotten lounge, she felt like a woman who'd just lost a bet she didn't know she'd made. "Back to work," she said finally, her voice sharper than intended. Lucas picked up his mop and left without a word, the door closing softly behind him. Eleanor stood alone, the echo of Chopin lingering in the air like a challenge she wasn't sure she could meet. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a headache and a nagging sense of unease. She dreamed of piano keys and her mother's laugh, of Lucas's hands moving over the ivories with a tenderness that felt like an accusation. She pushed it aside, dressing in her usual armor, a charcoal suit and a string of pearls, and arrived at the office determined to regain control. The merger was finalized by noon, her team buzzing with the victory, but her mind kept drifting to the lounge, to the man who turned her flippant challenge into something real. She didn't see Lucas for days. His shifts were nocturnal, hers diurnal, their worlds orbiting on different planes. But she found herself lingering in the office after hours, hoping to catch the hum of his vacuum or the faint strains of music. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more. She wasn't the kind of woman who lost herself over a man, especially not a janitor. And yet, she couldn't shake the memory of his playing, the way it had cracked open something inside her. On the fifth night, she gave in. She went to the lounge, the Steinway silent in the corner. She sat at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. She hadn't played since she was a girl, since her mother's illness had turned music into a reminder of loss. She pressed a key, the note sharp and wrong in the quiet. Frustrated, she closed the lid and stood, only to find Lucas in the doorway, a bucket in one hand, watching her. "You play?" he asked, his voice neutral but his eyes curious. "Not anymore," she said, brushing past him. "I was just a broken bar checking something." He didn't press, but as she reached the door, he said, "If you want to learn again, I could teach you." She froze, her hand on the knob. The offer was simple, almost innocent, but it felt like a dare. She turned, meeting his gaze. "Why would I want that?" "Because you miss it," he said, not blinking. "I saw it in your face the other night." Her instinct was to snap, to shut him down, but the truth in his words stung. She did miss it, the music, the freedom, the part of herself she'd buried under ambition and control. She wanted to say yes, to let him teach her, but the idea of being vulnerable in front of him was terrifying. "I'll think about it," she said, and left before he could respond. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor found herself at a crossroads. The merger was a success, her empire growing, but the victory felt hollow. She started leaving work early, spending evenings at home with a glass of wine and her mother's old Chopin recordings. She didn't go back to the lounge, but she couldn't stop thinking about Lucas, his hands, his music, his quiet defiance. She'd built her life on control, on never needing anyone, but now she wondered if she'd been wrong. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to the office. The lounge was dark, but the piano glowed faintly in the moonlight. She sat at the bench, her fingers trembling as she played a halting version of the Nocturne's opening bars. It was clumsy, nothing like Lucas's performance, but it felt like coming home. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt his presence behind her. "Keep going," he said softly. She turned, her heart racing. "I can't. It's been too long." "You can," he said, sitting beside her. He guided her hands to the keys, his touch gentle but firm. "Start slow, let it come back." They played together, her hesitant notes blending with his steady ones. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt alive, not just a CEO but a woman who could still feel, still create. When they finished, she looked at him, her walls crumbling. "I don't know if I can marry you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I want to know you." Lucas smiled, a real one this time. "That's a start." The music had undone her, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be put back together. Not the old way, at least. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. Eleanor and Lucas met in the lounge after hours, not every night but often enough that the space became their sanctuary. He taught her Chopin, piece by piece, his patience a counterpoint to her impatience. She was a beginner again, her fingers stumbling, but with each lesson, she reclaimed a part of herself she'd thought lost. Lucas never pushed, never asked for more than she was ready to give, but his presence, steady, unassuming, challenged her in ways no boardroom ever had. She learned about him in fragments. He'd studied music at Gilead before his mother's illness forced him to drop out. He'd taken the janitor job for its simplicity, for the solitude that let him compose in his head while he worked. He showed her his compositions one night, handwritten scores tucked into a worn notebook. They were raw, haunting, and beautiful, like him. Eleanor didn't tell anyone about their lessons. Her world of board members, investors, the media wouldn't understand. She was the Iron Queen, untouchable, not a woman who sat at a piano with a janitor, laughing when she missed a note or blushing when his hand brushed hers. But with Lucas, she wasn't a CEO. She was just Eleanor, and that was enough. One evening, as snow fell outside, they finished the Nocturne together, her part shaky but earnest, his flawless. She looked at him, her heart full. "I don't know what this is," she said, "but I don't want it to stop." The lounge had become their secret world, a pocket of time where Eleanor Voss, the unyielding CEO of Voss Enterprises, could shed her armor and become someone softer, someone who laughed at her own fumbled notes and felt her pulse quicken when Lucas's hand brushed hers on the piano keys. The Steinway, once a forgotten relic, was now a bridge between their worlds, his of quiet resilience, hers of relentless ambition. Each evening they spent together, playing Chopin or sharing fragments of their lives, chipped away at the walls Eleanor had built over years of clawing her way to the top. She was 38, a woman who'd conquered boardrooms and silenced critics, yet here she was, learning to play again, learning to feel again, under the steady gaze of a janitor who saw her not as a titan but as a woman. Their lessons had evolved into something more. Lucas would arrive after his shift, his navy jumpsuit swapped for a plain t-shirt and jeans, his dark hair still slightly mussed from the day's work. Eleanor would be waiting, her tailored suits replaced by simpler blouses, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. They'd sit side by side at the piano, working through the Nocturne in E-flat major, out tackling new pieces of Chopin's waltzes, his mazurkas, each note a step deeper into trust. Lucas was patient, never mocking her mistakes, only offering quiet corrections or a nod when she got it right. His hands, calloused from years of manual labor, moved with a grace that still startled her, each phrase he played a reminder of the talent he'd buried in a life of solitude. She learned more about him in those late-night hours. His mother had been a music teacher in a small town upstate, pouring her love of Chopin and Beethoven into her only son. Lucas had been a prodigy, accepted to Gilead at 17, but when his mother fell ill, he left to care for her, taking odd jobs to pay the bills. After her death, he'd stayed away from the concert halls, choosing the quiet of night shifts over the spotlight. "Music's not about applause for me," he told her one night. his voice low as he traced the edge of a key. It's about what it says when no one's listening. Eleanor understood, or thought she did. Her own mother, a concert pianist, had filled their home with music until cancer stole her when Eleanor was 12. The piano had become a ghost after that, a reminder of loss she'd locked away. Her father, a pragmatic businessman, had pushed her toward ambition, toward a world of numbers and power where emotions couldn't derail her. She'd succeeded, building Voss Enterprises into a tech empire, but the cost was a life stripped of warmth. Until Lucas, until the music. Their connection wasn't just about the piano, though. It was the way he looked at her, not with awe or calculation, but with a quiet honesty that made her feel seen. One night, after they'd mangled a particularly tricky passage of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, she laughed, a real laugh that echoed in the empty lounge. Lucas grinned, his eyes crinkling, and said, "You're getting better. You'll be out playing me soon." "Liar," she shot back, but her chest felt light, like she'd shed a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. She wanted to tell him how much these moments meant, how they were rewriting her, but words felt too small. Instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers tentative. He didn't pull away. His thumb brushed her knuckles, and the air between them shifted, charged with a possibility neither had named. The kiss that followed was inevitable, soft at first, then deepening with the weight of everything unsaid. It was like the music, a tentative, then bold, a melody they were creating together. When they pulled apart, Eleanor's heart was racing, her usual control nowhere to be found. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," Lucas said, his smile small but real. "But I don't want to stop." She didn't either. But the world outside the lounge was waiting at her boardroom, her empire, the expectations that came with being Eleanor Voss. She'd thrown out the marriage challenge as a joke, a bourbon-fueled whim, but now it felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Not because she didn't care, but because caring this much terrified her. The next few weeks were a delicate dance. Eleanor's days were filled with meetings, mergers, and the relentless pace of running a company that employed thousands. She was negotiating a partnership with a European conglomerate, a deal that could redefine her legacy. But at night, she was in a lounge, her fingers stumbling over Chopin, her heart stumbling over Lucas. He never asked for more than she could give, never pushed for answers about what they were or where this was going. But his presence was a question in itself, one she couldn't ignore. One evening, as they worked through the Fantasy Impromptu, Lucas stopped mid-phrase, his hand stilling on the keys. "Why did you say it?" he asked, his voice quiet but direct. "That night, the marriage thing." Eleanor froze, her fingers hovering over the piano. She'd avoided thinking about it, the reckless challenge that had started this. "I was a broken bar board. It was a stupid joke. I didn't think you'd actually play." "But I did," he said, turning to face her. "And now we're here." She swallowed, her throat tight. "And now we're here." He didn't press, but his eyes held hers, searching. She wanted to tell him everything, how his music had cracked open a part of her she'd buried, how he made her want to be more than the Iron Queen of Voss Enterprises. But the words stuck. Instead, she leaned in and kissed him, letting the music and the moment say what she couldn't. Their nights continued, but the outside world began to intrude. Margaret, her assistant, started giving her curious looks when she stayed late, and a board member commented on her distracted demeanor during a strategy session. Eleanor brushed it off, but the pressure was mounting. The European deal was faltering, her investors were restless, and the media was sniffing around for cracks in her flawless facade. She was Eleanor Voss. She didn't have time for vulnerability, for love, for a janitor who played Chopin like a god. But Lucas was more than that, and she knew it. One night, he showed her a composition he'd been working on, a piece inspired by her. He played it hesitantly, the notes cascading like water, full of longing and light. When he finished, she was crying, silent tears she hadn't shed since her mother's funeral. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's you," he said simply. She wanted to stay in that moment forever, but reality was closing in. The next day, a tabloid ran a blurry photo of her leaving the office late, captioned with speculation about her secret nights. It didn't mention Lucas, but it was enough to make her stomach churn. She couldn't afford a scandal, not now, not when her company was at a tipping point. She started cancelling their lessons, citing work, but the truth was she was scared not of him, but of what he made her feel. Lucas noticed. Of course he did. One night, he cornered her in the lounge, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen. "You're pulling away," he said. "Why?" She crossed her arms, her old defenses snapping into place. "I'm busy, Lucas. I run a company." "You know that." "It's not about the company," he said, stepping closer. "It's about you being afraid." Her jaw tightened. "You don't know me." "I do," he said, his voice steady. "I know the way you play when you think no one's listening. I know the way you look when you're happy, really happy. And I know you're running from this because it's real." She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was a weight she couldn't lift. She turned away, her hands trembling. "I can't do this." "Not now." "Then when?" he asked, his voice soft but unyielding. "When you're done conquering the world. When you're too tired to feel anything." She didn't answer. She couldn't. She left the lounge, the door closing behind her like a final note. For a week, she avoided him. She threw herself into work, finalizing the European deal, charming investors, being the Eleanor Voss everyone expected. But at night, alone in her penthouse, she played his composition in her head, the notes haunting her. She missed him, the music, the quiet, the way he made her feel alive. She'd spent her life building an empire, but what was it worth if she was alone at the top? On the 8th night, she couldn't take it anymore. She went to the lounge, half expecting it to be empty. But Lucas was there, playing the nocturne, the same piece that had started it all. He didn't stop when she entered, but his eyes met hers, and she saw the hurt there, the hope. She sat beside him, her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said, the words heavy. "I got scared. I've never a broken bar. I've never felt like this." He stopped playing, the silence loud. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "I'm not asking you to give up who you are. I just want to be part of it." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the man who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and hadn't flinched. She thought of her mother, of the music that had once been her home, of the life she could have if she let herself choose it. "I don't know if I can marry you," she said, echoing her words from months ago. "But I want to try. I want us." Lucas smiled, a slow, warm smile that felt like sunlight. "That's enough for now." They played the nocturne together, her notes hesitant, his steady, their hands brushing on the keys. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The world outside could wait to the boardrooms, the deals, the expectations. For now, there was only the music, and the man who'd made her believe in it again. Eleanor Voss, the woman who'd conquered everything, had finally found something worth surrendering to. The lounge was no longer just a room, it was a sanctuary where Eleanor Voss and Lucas had carved out a fragile, beautiful space. Their nights at the Steinway had become a ritual, a place where the world's demands of her empire, his solitude fell away, leaving only the music and the unspoken promises between them. Eleanor, the CEO who'd built Voss Enterprises into a tech juggernaut, had found something she hadn't known she was searching for, a man who saw her not as a title but as a woman, flawed and yearning, her fingers faltering on Chopin's notes but growing steadier with each lesson. Lucas, the janitor whose hands danced across the keys with a prodigy's grace, had given her more than music, he'd given her permission to feel again. But the world outside the lounge was not so forgiving. Eleanor's life was a tightly wound machine, and her growing connection with Lucas was a variable she hadn't accounted for. The European deal she'd been negotiating was finalized, a triumph that solidified her legacy, but it came with new pressure, so investor meetings, international summits, and a media spotlight that felt like a microscope. The tabloid photo from weeks ago, blurry but damning, had sparked whispers, and though it hadn't named Lucas, Eleanor knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. She was the Iron Queen, untouchable, but lovier because she was beginning to admit that's what this was. Made her vulnerable in ways she'd never anticipated. Their evenings continued, but the weight of her world began to seep into the lounge. One night, as they worked through Chopin's waltz in C-sharp minor, Eleanor's fingers slipped, a sour note breaking the melody. She cursed under her breath, her frustration spilling over. "I can't do this tonight," she said, pushing back from the piano. Lucas watched her, his hands resting on the keys. "What's wrong?" She paced to the window, the city skyline glittering below like a field of stars she could never reach. "Everything. The board's breathing down my neck, the press is circling, and I'm sitting here pretending I can be someone I'm not." "You're not pretending," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're playing. You're feeling. That's you, Eleanor, whether you admit it or not." She turned, her eyes flashing. "You don't get it, Lucas. I'm not just Eleanor. I'm Voss Enterprises. Thousands of people depend on me. One wrong move, one scandal, and it all comes crashing down." He stood, closing the distance between them. "And what's the cost of keeping it all together? You're not a machine. You're allowed to want something for yourself." His words hit like a chord, resonant and true, but they scared her. Wanting him, wanting this, felt like a betrayal of the woman she'd built herself to be. She shook her head, stepping back. "I need to focus. The summit's in 2 weeks. I can't a broken bar. I can't be distracted." Lucas's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "If that's what you need," he said, and returned to the piano, his fingers brushing the keys without playing. The silence was louder than any music. She left the lounge that night with a knot in her chest, torn between the safety of her old life and the pull of something new. For days, she threw herself into work, avoiding the lounge, avoiding Lucas. She told herself it was temporary, just until the summit was over, but each night alone in her penthouse felt colder, the silence heavier. She played his composition of the one he'd written for Hera on her phone, the notes a ghost of their time together. She missed him, but fear kept her away. Fear of losing control, of losing herself, of losing everything she'd built. The summit came, a whirlwind of speeches and negotiations in a sleek conference center in London. Eleanor was at her best, a sharp, commanding, every inch the CEO. She closed deals, charmed investors, and deflected questions about her personal life with practiced ease. But in the quiet moments, between meetings or in the hotel's sterile suite, she felt the absence of the lounge, of Lucas's steady presence. She wondered what he was doing, if he was playing alone in the dark, if he missed her as much as she missed him. On the final night, after a gala where she'd smiled for cameras and shaken hands with dignitaries, she sat at the hotel bar, a glass of bourbon untouched in front of her. Her phone buzzed, a message from Margaret, her assistant. "Found this in the lounge. Thought you should see it." Attached was a photo of a sheet of music, handwritten, titled for Eleanor. It was Lucas's composition, left on the piano bench like a message in a bottle. She stared at the image, her throat tightening. He hadn't given up on her, even when she'd pushed him away. She booked the next flight back to New York, the decision impulsive but certain. She couldn't keep running from him. When she landed, it was past midnight. She went straight to the office, her heart pounding as she took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The lounge was dark, the Steinway shadow in the corner. She sat at the bench, her fingers tracing the keys, and began to play his composition. The notes were halting, imperfect, but they were hers, a declaration of everything she'd been too afraid to say. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt the air shift, the way it always did when he was near. Lucas stood in the doorway, his jumpsuit slightly rumpled, his eyes searching hers. "You're back," he said, his voice soft but guarded. "I couldn't stay away," she admitted, her hands stilling. "I tried, Lucas. I tried to be the person I was before, but I can't. Not anymore." He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "What changed?" "You," she said simply. "Your music. The way you see me. I've spent my life building something unbreakable, but it's lonely at the top, and I don't want to be lonely anymore." He sat beside her, the bench creaking faintly. "I'm not asking you to give up your life, Eleanor, I just want to be in it." She looked at him, her walls crumbling. "I know, and I want that too, but it's not easy. The world I live in, a broken bar, it's not kind to people like us." "Then we make our own world," he said, his hand finding hers. Right here. With this, he played a single note, a clear, bright C, and it felt like a beginning. They played together, his composition this time, her fingers tentative but growing bolder with each measure. The music was a conversation, a promise, a way to say what words couldn't. When they finished, she leaned into him, her forehead against his, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was fighting herself. The weeks that followed were a balancing act. Eleanor returned to her role as CEO, but she made time for the lounge, for Lucas. They kept their nights private, a secret shared only with the Steinway. She started inviting him to her penthouse, where they'd play on her mother's old upright piano, laughing over takeout and wine. He showed her more of his compositions, each one a window into his soul, and she began to write her own simple, clumsy melodies that he praised with a sincerity that made her blush. But the world was watching. A reporter caught wind of their late-night meetings, and soon, a headline screamed, Voss Enterprises CEO's secret romance with Janitor. The article was thin on details but heavy on speculation, and it sent ripples through her company. Board members called emergency meetings, investors demanded reassurances, and Eleanor's carefully curated image began to crack. She faced the board with her usual steel, but inside, she was reeling. They didn't care about her happiness, only the company's stock price. This is a distraction, one director said, his voice dripping with disdain. You're risking everything for a fling. It's not a fling, she snapped, her voice colder than she felt. And I'm not risking anything. I'm still the CEO who doubled our revenue in 3 years. My personal life is none of your business. But it was. She knew it was. And when she told Lucas about the article, his face tightened, his hands pausing over the keys. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything, he said. You're not, she insisted. But the fear was there, gnawing at her. She loved him as she could admit that now, but love came with a cost, and she wasn't sure she could pay it. The turning point came at the company's annual gala, a glittering event attended by industry leaders and media. Eleanor had planned to go alone, to present the untouchable facade the world expected. But as she stood in her penthouse, staring at the emerald gown she'd chosen, she realized she didn't want to do it alone. She called Lucas, her voice shaking. Come with me. He hesitated. You sure? That's your world, not mine. I want it to be ours, she said, and meant it. He arrived in a simple black suit, his hair tamed but his eyes still carrying that quiet intensity. When they entered the ballroom, heads turned, whispers following them like a breeze. Eleanor held his hand, her chin high, daring anyone to challenge her. The media snapped photos, the board members stared, but she didn't care. For the first time, she was choosing herself. They danced, his hand steady on her waist, and when the band played a Chopin waltz, he leaned in and whispered, "Want to show them up?" She laughed, a sound that turned heads. Let's. They took the stage, the crowd parting, and sat at the grand piano set up for the evening's entertainment. Eleanor's hands shook, but Lucas's were steady beside her. They played the Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece that had started it all, her notes hesitant but heartfelt, his flawless and warm. The room fell silent, the music weaving a spell that held everyone captive. When they finished, the applause was deafening, but Eleanor only saw Lucas, his smile a mirror of her own. The headlines the next day were kinder than she'd expected, framing their story as a fairy tale rather than a scandal. The board backed off, the stock stabilized, and Eleanor realized she'd underestimated the world's appetite for a love story. But more than that, she'd underestimated herself. She wasn't just the Iron Queen, she was Eleanor, a woman who could love and lead, who could play Chopin and build empires. That night, in the lounge, she turned to Lucas. I meant it, you know. That first night. I didn't know it then, but I do now. He raised a brow, an echo of her smirk from months ago. The marriage part? She laughed, her heart full. Maybe. But for now, this is enough.